Father Duffy looked up. You don't understand. The 30th Gospel talks about this podcast at this place at this time. It describes it as terrifying, driving mad those who hear it. We have to warn them! PseudoPod, episode 595, May 18th, 2018. This week's story, Mysterium Tremendum, Part 2, by Laird Barron. Hi everyone, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alasdair, your host, and this week continues our experiment with a long-form 3-part story by Laird Barron. The narration is once again by the incomparable John Padgett, so without further ado, please allow me to take an item off the list of things I have always wanted to say on a live mic. Previously on PseudoPod. Two couples, Willem and Glenn, Dane and Victor, go on a camping trip to the Pacific Northwest, which Willem uses as an excuse to investigate some leads and details from a mysterious occult gazetteer known as the Black Guide, which he discovers in a bookstore. Having talked to the previous owner of the book by phone, Willem is visited in the night by a mysterious phantom presence, wearing the form of Thomas, a deceased acquaintance of Glenn, Dane and Victor's. The visitor ominously assures Willem that he is not there to dissuade them from a planned hiking side trip to a cult-linked stone dolmen in the woods, but instead he intimates darker forces are afoot. The next morning, Victor confirms that himself, Thomas, and Dane were involved in the occult in their youth, and that Thomas's death was not as simple as previously related, amounting to a sudden, mystifying disappearance in the wilderness. And now, listen on to the second part of this true story.
Seven. Skwim, pronounced Skwim by the locals, was lovely that summer. The town rested near the Dungeness River at the heart of a shallow basin of the Dungeness-Sequim Valley, and not far from the bay. Fields of lavender and poppies and tulips dominated the countryside. There were farms and mills and old, dusty roads that wound between wooden fences and stands of oak and birch and poplar trees. Raymond Carver wrote a poem about Skwim. I'd never read that one. Our merry band rolled into town after dark, and since Skwim was the kind of place that locked its doors at sundown, we proceeded directly to the bed and breakfast, a cute 2-story farmhouse where Glenn had rented our rooms. The proprietors were an elderly couple named Leland and Portia Teller. Mrs. Teller fixed us a nice dinner despite our being 3 hours late. Baked salmon, steamed carrots, sourdough bread, and ice cream and black coffee for dessert. After dinner, we sat on the front porch in a collection of rockers and a swing and smoked cigarettes. Glenn shared one with Dane. They reclined on the swing and giggled like teenagers. The night was muggy and overcast. Lights were off all over town except for the neon flicker of a bar several blocks down and across the parking lot of a community baseball diamond. It was a good thing I hadn't been drinking, because watching Glenn casually indulge in a habit we'd mutually conquered at great physical and mental anguish ignited a slow burn in my chest. Were I drunk and vulnerable, God knows what I'd have done. Wept, cursed him, slapped him, walked away into the night and disappeared. A half-dozen times I opened my mouth to say something sharp and ill-tempered. I mastered the impulse. I knew how Glenn would react if I confronted him. He'd laugh and play it as a joke. Then we wouldn't talk for the rest of the trip. I bit my tongue. I moved to the opposite end of the porch and counted lights. Small towns disquieted me with their clannishness, their secretiveness, how everybody interacted as an extended dirt-beneath-the-fingernails family, how they scurried into their modernized huts as the sun set. A city boy was always a stranger, no matter how much money he spent or how much he smiled. Being gay and from the wicked metropolis wasn't a winning combination with country folk. Later, tucked as near the edge of the bed as possible, I studied the cover of the Black Guide, entranced by the broken ring. What was the significance? Its thickness, the suggestion of whorls, brought to mind images of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail. This wasn't the Ouroboros. This was more worm-like, leech-like, and it disturbed me that it wasn't eating its tail. The jaws, the proboscis, the shearing appendage were free to devour other, weaker delicacies. 8. The next day marked the opening celebrations of the Lavender Festival, an event that included a downtown farmers market and fair and a bus tour of the 7 major lavender farms in the area. None of us were lavender aficionados, yet we'd all enjoyed the film Perfume, the story of a murderer, while Victor and I had also read the novel by Suskind. There were 2 buses ready to ferry us around the area. I was grateful for the tinted windows and air conditioning as the temperature had already climbed into the 90s by 11 a.m. The sun hung low and blazed hellishly, but, secure in our plush seats behind dim glass, we laughed. Glenn surprised me by holding my hand. The bus was crowded with senior citizens and a smattering of sunburned couples and their raucous children. Nobody paid us any mind, nor did I think they would. However, his lack of customary reserve took me off guard. I accepted his overture as further reproachment for hurting my feelings by smoking with Dane. Obviously, he wished to appease my jealousy by jumping at the idea of the farm tour. The tour was organized in the manner of a wine tasting. We spent the long, insufferably hot day visiting restaurants and observing demonstrations of lavender's multifarious uses in the culinary arts. The traveling show wound down late in the afternoon, and we loaded into the Land Rover and sped off in search of booze. The Sarcobatus Tavern was closest and not too crowded despite the numerous tourists wandering the streets. A half-dozen college-age guys occupied a table near the bar. Clean-shaven, muscular, decked in a regulation fraternity field attire, baseball caps, sweaters, cargo pants, and athletic shoes. There were a lot of empty bottles on the table. Clearly out of their element and heat-maddened, a couple of the kids gave us hard, bleary stares. "Damn it," I said. "What?" Glenn said, although he apparently noticed them too because he squeezed my elbow, then stepped away from me. Dane actually said hello to the group in a large, gregarious tone. A burly kid wearing a Washington State University Cougars cap said something unfriendly, and his friends clapped and jeered. Dane winked and flipped the double bird to each of them. "And you, and you, and you, and you too, cutie pie," with exaggerated gusto. And while the college boys fumed and sulked, he ordered a round of beers that we carried to the opposite corner of the tavern near a pinball machine with its cord pulled out of the wall. "Great Scott," Glenn said a few moments after picking up a stray newspaper and scanning the headlines. It still amazed me that my lover seldom actually swore by means of shit or asshole or that hoary crowd-pleaser fuck. No, with Glenn it was always hell, damn, holy cow, and great Scott. And, on special occasions, jeepers and zoons. I wasn't fully privy to the origin of this eccentricity, except to note it had to do with the fondness of Golden Age comics and an aversion to his father's egregious addiction to cursing, which I gather had been a subject of lifelong embarrassment. 10 shot dead at Cantina in Ciudad Juarez. 2 guys in motorcycle helmets ran in and opened fire with submachine guns. No leads. Police suspect it's connected to drugs. We all snorted derisive laughter at his humor. Dane said, "Man, I really liked vacationing in Mexico. No way, Jose. That isn't any place for a gringo these days." "It's not any place for Mexicans," Glenn said. 11,000 people killed since 2006 via drug violence. I think you might be safer signing up for Iraq." "Nonsense. Cancun is safe as houses, as the Brits say," Victor said. Sure, of course Cancun is safe," Glenn said, "but Cancun isn't Mexico. It's an American college resort. Home away from home to damn fool tourists and yon Neanderthals." "The hell you say?" "Cancun's technically Mexico, just not the real Mexico." "What about Cabo?" "Fake Mexico." I want a Corona, Dane said. Hey, barkeep, 4 Coronas. A ripe lemon wedge this time, for the love of baby Jesus. Now, friends, let us weep for poor old Mexico. We drank our beers and decided the hour had come to mosey out of town. I went into the restroom and pissed, and when I returned, only 3 of the frat brothers were still hanging around the tavern. Music from outside throbbed through the window glass. I found everybody else in the parking lot, a fist fight already in progress. Dane was on one knee, pressed against the wheel well of a truck tricked out with oversized tires and radio antenna. The truck's headlights were on. Its door was open, and radio speakers boomed 4 kicks by the Kings of Leon. Cougar's Cap and 2 of the other guys stood in a semicircle and were punching him in the head. His scalp and nose ran with blood. Darkness had fallen, and his blood flowed black in the neon lighting. I lunged, and Glenn caught my arm. Don't get in his way, baby. Dane bellowed and surged to his feet, scattering his opponents. He slapped Cougar's Cap on the ear. While the kid held his ear and shrieked, Dane snatched the antenna off the truck and began whipping all 3 of them. He grinned through a mask of gore, cocking his forearm behind his neck and then slashing in an elegant diamond pattern. The dying sun limned him in gold. He was a Viking god exacting retribution on his foes. The hair on my arms prickled, and I gaped in awe. Then Glenn yelled, and I turned and partially blocked a golf club swung at my head. The other 3 frat boys had followed us. Glenn rolled around on the ground with the guy who'd tackled him. Another went after Victor, who adroitly fled behind the Land Rover. I had a moment to admire at the lightness of his step. The golf club made a thwack as it struck my upraised arm. The pain cranked a rotor in my brain and turned operation over to the lizard. I laughed with rage and joy and impending lunacy. I caught the golf club as my attacker, a J. Crew pretty boy, readied for another crack at me and wrenched him off balance. I kneed him in the balls. He vomited and slumped on all 4s, and I grabbed his hair and kneed him in the jaw, twice, with enthusiasm. His nose and jaw squished nicely. He crawled away, spewing blood and teeth as he shrieked. The other punk sat astride Glenn's chest, and they were choking one another. I drove the toe of my steel-toed boot into the frat boy's kidney, and he recoiled like a worm zapped by an electrode. He went purple almost instantly as his throat shut, paralyzed. Glenn rolled him over and proceeded to smash his face. The notion that someone might actually die in the fracas flickered through my mind, but my will to put the brakes on melted fast as the ultra-violence swept me along. Pivoting again, I saw Victor had scooted up onto the windshield of the Land Rover, kicking wildly. His opponent belly-flopped across the hood, intent on clambering atop him. I grabbed the kid's ankles and jerked him backward, dragging him over the jaggedy hood ornament, hoisting his legs as in a game of wheelbarrow so his face slid down the grill, clunked off the bumper, and slammed into the asphalt. I dropped his legs. He didn't move, as blood seeped in a puddle around his head. A shadow passed through my peripheral vision. Dane seized one of the poor bastards by the crotch and neck and gorilla-pressed him overhead. I'd not seen anything like that in my entire life. But there it was, Dane, raising him up in a Frazetta pose from the cover of a Conan novel. Dane tossed him against the side of the truck. The frat boy bounced and landed on his shoulder and neck, and Dane methodically lined up and drop-kicked him in the ribs. Like me, Dane wore heavy-duty boots, although his didn't have any metal reinforcement. It sounded like an axe whacking into a log. Magnificent. The bartender stood in the doorway of the tavern. I waved at her, and the kid, whose jaw I'd certainly broken, chucked a loose piece of concrete at me, and it caromed off my temple. I was still flattened on the ground, trying to shake free of the red haze as Cougar's Cap wrapped himself around Dane's leg and bit him in the thigh. Somebody's boot thumped my left butt cheek. Victor came swooping in and snatched up the concrete chunk and hurled it, chasing away whomever was trying to punt my ass around my shoulders. He helped me to my feet, and in the nick of time, Glenn went to the Land Rover and rummaged around under the front seat. He came around with a shiny, tiny automatic. Me and Victor got hold of him, and I took the pistol away and stuck it in my pocket. Meanwhile, Dane elbowed poor Cougar's cap, the cap had flown off long since, on the crown of his skull until the frat boy stopped gnawing his leg and curled into a fetal position. The rest, the ones still ambulatory, had fled at the appearance of the gun. "Jesus jumping Christ!" Victor said. "We gotta bail before the heat gets here and guns us down like dogs." "Shit, where'd you get the piece? Do you even have a permit?" I said to Glenn. His eyes were wild. "That time those gangbangers cornered us in Rainier," he said. "I went to a pawn shop the next day. I said, oh, for the love of... Nothing happened. They were just screwing with us." It scared and hurt me he'd gone to such an extreme and then successfully kept a secret for this long. The bus incident was 2 years gone, and I'd not suspected it affected him so deeply. This trip was proving to be painfully educational. He looked away. "Not going to ever take chances again. Say what you like." I wanted to grab his collar and shake some sense into him. Things were moving too fast. My emotional equilibrium, my sense of security, and our private little world together was sliding from under my feet. "So long, fuckers," Dane said, vaunting as Achilles had after wreaking havoc among his foes before the walls of Troy. He stomped Cougar's cap's splayed hand. We piled into the truck. I shouldn't have been driving with what was a probable concussion and all the blood dripping into my eyes, but nobody else volunteered. I smoked rubber. 9. I pulled into a Rite Aid and killed the engine. Victor was the only one of us who didn't look as if somebody had dumped a bucket of pig's blood over his head. He ran in and bought bandages, dental floss, cotton balls, ibuprofen, medicinal alcohol, and 2 cases of natty ice. Dane draped a towel over his face and it turned red. "Now this takes me back to the good old days," he said. His voice sounded nasally because his nose was smashed to pulp. "We should get to an emergency room," Glenn said. His eye was blackened and he'd ruined his shirt on the asphalt. Otherwise, he'd escaped the battle relatively unscathed. He checked my scalp. The bleeding had mostly stopped. My left arm was swollen and purple from where the golf club had caught me. Sharp pains radiated from my foot. I figured it got stepped on in the confusion. "No hospital," I said. "If the cops are looking for us, we'll get nailed." "Dane, I hope to God you didn't pay with a credit card back there." "What? No, man, I paid cash. I always pay cash if I think there's going to be a rumble." "You thought there was going to be a fight?" "Actually, I knew there'd be one. I decided to beat the hell out of those punks the minute we walked in. They rubbed me the wrong way." "That lady bartender probably got our plates anyhow," Victor said. He cracked beers and handed them around. "Oh man, warm natty sucks. Might as well give me a can of watery cream corn," Dane said. "Guess if you're going to keep tangling with gangs of frat boys half your age, you'd best cultivate a taste for creamed food in general, eh?" I said. Dane hissed in pain. Yep. Busted tooth. One of those assholes knocked it loose and I just swallowed the damn thing. Glenn tell you about the bikers we thrashed at a Willie Nelson concert? That's why I've got so much gold in my grill." "Willie Nelson? Everybody loves Willie," Glenn said. "Vicky, are you serious? You going to stitch the Danester's scalp with dental floss?" Victor poured a capful of alcohol across a needle. "I can do it. Willem says no hospital. I am confident Hagar the Horrible is with Willem on this one, right, sweetie?" "Right," Dane said in his rusty, honking voice. "Besides, we still got some camping to do. That park is what, an hour from here? Let's make ourselves scarce in case Johnny Law comes around." Glenn said, "Look, boys, I'm not exactly high on roughing it in the boonies at the moment. I think we should get back to Seattle and soak away our misery in the hot tub. Willem?" The adrenaline hadn't completely worn off, nor the rush from the sense of admiration I'd received from my comrades. I wasn't about to let Dane out-tough me. "I'm game for the park. Another case of beer and some ice for the cooler, and we're good to go." Glenn took my face in his hands. He said in a whisper, "You look like you got hit in the head with a rock, my dear." "Is that what it was?" I said. He kissed my nose. You are such a Billy badass. Yee-haw! I cheered sotto voce. Victor finished stitching Dane's lacerated scalp. He washed his hands in the alcohol, then returned to the store for bags of ice and more beer. I drove east from Skwim along the old Mystery Mountain Highway, a 2-lane blacktop in major decline. It carried us up from the valley floor into big timber along the flank of Mystery Mountain. I dodged potholes while keeping an eye on the rearview mirror for police flashers. Occasionally deer froze in the sweep of the headlights, eyes glittering from the brush and ferns at the road's edge. I'd expected heavy July traffic, but there weren't any other cars in sight. Glenn said, "Jeepers, kind of creepy through here, isn't it?" "Yeah, Fred," Victor said. "You should paint the Pimpmobile green and slap a flower on the door. Don't forget to recruit a hot, clueless Catholic school dropout in a not-so-hot dyke," Dane said. But Glenn was right. The woods were spooky. Mist thickened and clung to the bushes. Cold air rushed across my feet. I turned on the heater. Glenn explained that this road once served as the main access for several towns. A railroad line ran parallel, lost somewhere in the dark. A lot of timber was hacked down in the days of yore, although from my vantage, the wilderness had recovered and then some. Glenn unfolded a road atlas and studied it by flashlight. Victor told the story about the couple driving through woods just like these, while a radio broadcast reports the escape of inmates from a local asylum. Of course, the car breaks down and the boyfriend leaves his girl locked up while he goes for help, and all through the night she hears noises. She cowers on the floorboard as someone tries the door handles. The wind rises and branches scrape the roof. She wakes in broad daylight to the police rapping on the window. Upon exiting the car, she glances back and witnesses her boyfriend hanging upside down from a tree limb, his bloody fingernails scratching the roof as his corpse sways in the breeze.
"No asylums in these parts," I said. "On the other hand, there might be ghouls and goblins. The Clallam peoples spoke of demons that dwelt among the trees and in the earth. The white pioneers sure came to believe some of the tales." I'd read about this and other eerie factoids in the guide. Victor pressed another beer into my hand. Even though I didn't dare lift my gaze from the twisting road, I felt my companion's attention focused on me. This convinced me Victor wasn't kidding when he said they were all way into the supernatural during college. Were circumstances otherwise, I would have changed the subject, but I felt like a piece of meat tenderized by a mallet. The fight had drained from me, replaced by the fatalistic urge to confess or pontificate, which was an indicator I'd breached my alcohol threshold. To distract myself from the excruciating pain in my foot, arm, and skull, I dredged up my research from the pages of the Black Guide and explained how, according to local legends, diabolical spirits lurked in fissures and caverns of the mountains and the rivers and lakes and assumed the guise of loved ones or beautiful strangers and lured hunters and fishermen to their doom. There was even a tale of the Slango logging camp that vanished during the 1920s. The spirits seized unwary men and dragged them into the depths and feasted upon them, or worse. Victor wondered what worse meant. I assume worse meant torture or transformation. The demons might lobotomize their victims and change them into something inhuman. As it was a cautionary branch of native mythology, it was doubtless left vague as storytellers couldn't hope to match whatever horrors were conjured by the imaginations of their audiences. "Maybe the monsters enslave the ones they don't eat," he said in a half-serious manner. I flashed to dead Tom lying in an unmarked tomb and wondered if Victor was sharing that unwholesome thought. I drained my beer and gestured for another. "Now I really want to go camping," Glenn said. "The turn should be on the right, another 3 miles or so." Victor screamed and I almost swerved the Land Rover into the ditch. Considering the size of the trees, we would have likely been squashed like a can of soup under a steamroller. Glenn and Dane yelled at Victor for almost making them pee their pants. I didn't say anything. I glimpsed his expression in the rear view. His eyes were shiny as quarters in Glenn's flashlight beam.
"Dude, what was that?" Dane said. "Willem almost hit a deer? Spider climb into your shorts? What?"
"Sorry, guys. I looked back to the storage compartment and something moved."
WTF? One of those Native American bogeymen of Willem's? It have red eyes?
"Yeah, bright red as the devil. That's why I yelled."
"You didn't yell. You screamed."
"Because a black form moved in the back of the truck and its eyes glowed. Course I screamed. Diabolical Disney cartoon shit going down. I'm giving a shout out. Just Glenn's coat, though. Headlights reflected off the mile marker must have lit up the tape on the sleeves."
Glad that's solved and we aren't parked inside of one of those ginormous cedars."
I almost pulled over and asked Glenn to drive. Victor's cry had shaken me, and the mist was screwing with my vision, because as I considered Victor's explanation, shadows slipped among the shrubbery a few yards ahead, smaller than deer and lower to the ground. I counted 3 of these jittery, fast-moving shapes before they melted into the greater darkness. Coyotes? Dogs? My febrile imagination powered by dopamine, a fistful of ibuprofen, and God knew how many beers. The heavy, ponderous vehicle seemed fragile now, and I imagined how it must appear from above, a lonely speck trundling through an immense forest. Mild vertigo hit me, and the vehicle swayed just enough to cause an intake of breath from Glenn. I clamped my jaw and rallied. Thick branches obscured the Mystery Mountain Campground signpost, but I saw it in time and braked hard and swung into a gravel lane. I proceeded 100 yards to the darkened ranger shack. A carven wooden sign read, "Campground Full." A few lights glimmered through the trees. A Winnebago was the closest vehicle. Its occupants, a family of 4 dressed in identical bright orange shirts, clustered around a meager fire roasting hot dogs.
"Arg, we forgot the bloody marshmallows," Victor said.
"Maybe it's for the best there's no room at the inn," Glenn said. "The rangers might be on the lookout for us, too," Victor said.
"Oh, who cares? What now?"
The road forked. The paved section veered to the right and into the campground. The leftward path was unpaved and led into the boonies. If the black guide was accurate, this was the southern terminus of a logging road network that crossed the mountains. The Kalamov dolmen lay at the end of a footpath a few miles ahead. I said, 2/3 of a tank. I say we cruise up the trail and find a place to bivouac." The others agreed, and I eased the rig along the washboard lane. It climbed and climbed. Brush closed in tight and lashed the windows. A hillside rose steeply to my left. The hillside was covered in uprooted trees and rocks and boulders. A few of the rocks had tumbled loose and lay scattered in the path. I picked my way through them. Some were the size of bowling balls. Victor and Glenn warned me to hug the left-hand side of the road as they were looking at a precipitous drop. I glanced over at the tops of the trees below us, a phantom picket, flowing in an abyss. Erosion and debris narrowed the lane until the Land Rover had perhaps a foot to spare between its wheels and the cliff. I halted and shut off the engine and engaged the parking brake. I asked Victor to get my rucksack from behind his seat and hand me the humidor in the belly pouch.
"Oh, snap,"
Victor said.
"Honduran?"
"Nicaraguan," I said. "Be a love and snip one for me. Glenn, that bottle of scotch still in the glove box?" He knew better than to say a word. He rummaged through the compartment, retrieved the quarter bottle of Lafroig, and popped the cap. I had a slug of whiskey, then accepted the cigar from Victor and got it burning with Victor's lighter. The sweet, harsh taste filled my mouth and lungs, sent a rush of energy through me. I exhaled and watched the smoke curl against the windshield. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the tick of cooling metal and Dane's wet breathing. I saved these for a special occasion, a wedding, a funeral, a conjugal visit, but hell, no better time for scotch and cigars than right before you roll your rusted-out Land Rover over a 200-foot cliff. You boys help yourselves. Glenn and Victor lighted cigars. Dane said no thanks and held the towel to his face again. He said,
"You up to this, Willem?"
Glenn said, he's got it handled. He drove transports in the Army.
"Oh, I didn't realize you'd been in the military,"
Dane said. Thanks a lot, Glenn. Glenn shrugged. He doesn't like to spread it around, so I don't.
"Hell, man, thanks for all you guys do."
Dane roused himself and leaned over and patted my shoulder.
"Were you in Iraq?"
Yugoslavia. They stationed me in Kosovo for a year, and no, I didn't shoot anybody. I drove transports. We sat like that for a while. Finally, I drained the scotch and threw the bottle on the floor at Glenn's feet. I turned the key and pegged it. 10. Eventually, the grade leveled and swung away from the cliff. I parked in the middle of the road near a stand of fir trees. We pitched the tent by headlight beam, unrolled our sleeping bags, and collapsed. "Wait," Glenn said. "We need to make a bargain." He sounded strange, but it had been a strange day. My heart beat faster. Dane and Victor kept quiet, and that chilled me somehow, lending weight to the word bargain. These guys knew from bargains, didn't they? Glenn said, "Look, after what happened in town, maybe we'll get lucky and nobody will press charges. But wow, Dane, you might have ruined a couple of those guys.
I hope I smashed their guts out. Be serious."
The edge in Glenn's voice surprised me. I wished I could see his face. "I'm not asking for anything heavy. Let's just promise to see this through, okay? Will, I'm so proud of you. We were going to tuck our tails and go yipping home. Thanks for showing grit. The plan was to camp out a couple of nights and see the dolmen. That's what we should do. Tommy would approve." The mention of dead Tom gave me the creeps, and it reminded me how hurt I was that Glenn still hadn't confided the truth in me. Mostly, though, it gave me the creeps. Dane and Victor muttered acquiescence to Glenn's rather nebulous charge, and we did the hand-over-hand thing like a sports team. It was all awkward and phony, yet deadly serious in a Boy Scout way, and I squirmed and went along. Right before we fell asleep, I pulled him close and murmured, "We're going to talk about the gun when we get home." He kissed me and put his cheek against my chest. I dreamt horror show dreams and woke panicked, Glenn mumbling into my ear, sunlight blazing through the mesh of the tent flap. I crawled outside and vomited. My skull felt as if a football team had taken turns stomping it with cleats. I couldn't make a fist with my left hand. From wrist to elbow, my arm was puffed like a black and purple sausage. The possibility I might have a hairline fracture further soured my mood.
"Man alive, I thought a bear was ralphing in the blueberry bushes," Dane said.
His face resembled a bowl of mashed potatoes with the skins still on. He hunched on a log near the cold fire pit. The end of the log was charred to a point. I started to laugh and puked again. I worried my nausea might be due to a cerebral hematoma rather than a hangover, but it was pointless to follow that line of thought. Until I could find a loop, intersection, or a wide spot in the road, we were committed to this rustic interlude of the vacation. No way was I man enough to back the truck down to the campground. Glenn and Victor emerged from the lair. Glenn didn't look nearly as bad as Dane, but his black eye was impressive, and he limped and complained about pissing blood. Dane told him pissing blood was a rite of passage, then corrected it as pissage to some effect. I broke out the propane camp stove and boiled water for coffee and instant oatmeal. Dane poured 2 fingers of schnapps from his hip flask over his oatmeal, and I almost barfed again.
He grinned at us, and I saw that yes, indeed, he'd lost a tooth during the skirmish. His lip was fat and blistered, and Victor tenderly dabbed it with a napkin as they huddled together and shared a mug of coffee. Glenn spread the AAA road map of Washington State on the ground and weighed down the corners with rocks. "We're in this general vicinity." He poked the map with a dead stick. "Unfortunately, the area is represented as a green blob. No roads, nothing. Green blobbiness and more green blobbiness. Willem?" I fetched the black guide and opened it to the relevant entry, which was accompanied by a rude sketch, not unlike the Hollywood popularized treasure maps, and cryptic directions such as left at ravine and keep north of Devil Tower, Ware crevice, Leech. "The dolmen is about 12 miles yonder. I propose we pull stakes and ease along a bit. Gotta find a spot to turn this beast around." I indicated the Land Rover. "Good grief," Glenn said. "I didn't realize how far 17 miles was when we were sitting around the bar back in Seattle." Dane said,
"I'm with Willem. Let's see what's over the next hill, so to speak. As for that dolmen, the more I think on it, the more I think we've been had. There aren't any goddamn dolmens in this part of the world. I ought to know, Eric the Red being kin and such."
"This whole expedition is your idea." Victor swatted his shoulder. "There better be a dolmen or I'm kicking your ass back down this mountain."
"Yo, man, don't get so excited. I said dolmen, not dolomite."
Breaking camp proved twice the job as setting it up, because everyone was hurting from the previous evening's brutality. We hobbled like old men, and it was noon before we got packed and moving. Glenn took over at the wheel while I navigated. With my arm injury, I couldn't be trusted to keep the rig out of the ditch. The road continued along the mountainside, wending its way through a series of valleys. Our path intersected a handful of decrepit logging roads. There were occasional fields where forest had been leveled to stumps and roots, but nothing more recent than a decade or two. "Who comes out here if not loggers?" Victor said. I said mountain bikers, hikers, dope growers, game wardens, and surveyors. The state keeps tabs, I'm sure. The timber companies will be back with chainsaws buzzing sooner or later. Think anybody owns land, a house? You know, regular people. The Land Rover hit a pothole and I almost flew through the windshield. "Nah," I said. "Imagine what this will be like when it rains in September. A man would need mules to get around." The ravines were steep and rugged, with exposed rock and descended into cool, fuzzy shadows that never quite melted even during this, the hottest span of summer. Ridgelines hemmed the winding road, topped by evergreens and redwoods. Rabbits shot across our path. Far below, in the vast crease of the landscape, was the highway and civilization, obscured by a shifting blue haze. A hawk glided in the breeze. As the afternoon light reddened near the horizon, we arrived at a T intersection. There was a convenient site, bracketed by several trees and a picturesque scatter of boulders, a couple the approximate height and girth of the Land Rover, and it reminded me of a scene from a Western film where the cowboys sit around a cozy fire in the Badlands, eating beans and drinking coffee from 10 cups. If the guide was to be trusted, a semi-hidden footpath to the dolmen lay about a quarter of a mile down the southerly winding road. From there, the anonymous author claimed it to be an hour's hike to the dolmen. Once the tent was pitched, we took stock of our supplies and determined that between trail mix, canned hash, chili, and fruit cocktail, 3 5-gallon jerry cans of water, and a case of beer, the situation was golden for another night and possibly 2, should the next day's expedition prove too exhausting. Dane and Glenn took a hatchet into the woods and chopped several armloads of firewood, while Victor dug a shallow pit and lined it with stones. I munched aspirin and supervised. Glenn had made me a sling from a shirt. I wore it to be on the safe side and because it reduced the pain in my arm to the category of a toothache. Night crept over the wilderness, and the temperature cooled rapidly. Dane lighted a roaring bonfire and boiled a pot of chili and we washed that down with the better part of the case of beer. After supper, Glenn unpacked a teapot and mugs and fixed us instant cocoa. We sipped cocoa while Victor played a harmonica he'd bought in Seattle for the occasion.
"Dear God, not the harmonica,"
Dane said, and spat a gob of blood into the fire. His nose was definitely broken. He'd crunched it back into joint himself, much to my horror, at which Glenn and Victor snickered and mocked my squeamishness. Evidently, they'd seen this show many a time during their debauched college adventures. Glenn fiddled with the transistor radio until he dialed in a grainy, but reasonably clear signal, a canned programming station playing big band music from the 1930s and 40s. Victor rolled his eyes and tossed the harmonica through the open window of the truck. He rolled a couple of joints and we passed them around. Talk turned to the macabre, and I entertained them with Baba Yaga legends I'd heard around similar campfires while stationed in Eastern Europe. Then Glenn and Dane discussed their favorite horror movies, most of which I knew by heart, and I nodded off, lulled by their easy laughter, the warmth of the fire. Victor said something about doorways, and I snapped awake, but missed the rest as he and the others were speaking softly. He said, "It's only a coincidence." Dane said, "Come on, dude. Don't even start down that road." I cleared my throat. "What road?" Victor said, "The road not taken, of course. I need to shake hands with the governor. Ta-ta, my lovelies." He rose and walked into the shadows. "That's a wrap. Time for bed," Glenn said, and he kissed me and headed for the tent. Dane stared into the flames, and the red light bathed his ravaged face, and he glanced at me as if about to speak. He smiled, a sad, pained smile, and followed Glenn. Victor returned, zipping his fly. "Come here, pull up a rock." I patted the log I was sitting on. He settled next to me, his posture stiff as a plank. Soon, Dane's snores drifted from the tent, and Victor's shoulders relaxed. He tossed some dead leaves and twigs on the fire and said quietly, "What's on your mind, Will, old bean?" He was high as a kite. "Not much. The book. Weird thing happened to me before we left on the trip." I told him, as I had Glenn, about Tom's visitation, except I didn't pull any punches. As I spoke, Victor's expression became increasingly unhappy. He fumbled in his pocket for a pack of cigarettes and lighted one with apparent difficulty. He offered me a drag. I declined and said, "Glenn didn't tell you, huh? I sort of figured he would have." "This explains a lot. No wonder he's treated me like I'm Looney Tunes for..." He prefers to pretend we weren't a pack of superstitious nerds in college. Dane follows his lead. It's a survival tool. The front office in Denver sucks. They don't even know Dane is gay. And the hoodoo aspect, that shit ain't cool now that we're grown-ups. Getting your face punched like a speed bag is trendy. Crystal meditation and the golden bowl reading circle is for wackos. I mention anything along those lines, Dane gives me the stink eye, and Glenn changes subject like he's a senator putting the moves on the press corps. Why are we talking about it? Because I can tell you want to. You aren't the kind of guy to keep deep, dark secrets. The thing with Tommy isn't really a deep, dark secret. A minor scandal. I had a bedwetter-type dream about him the other night, and neither of the other bozos dream about him, which seems unfair. But whatever, man. I couldn't stand him, and you didn't even know him, yet we're the schleps who've got him on the brain. Seems rather simple to me, I said. He's obviously haunting you from beyond the grave. You stole Dane away when he got killed in a tragic manner that trapped his soul on the material plane. Oh, yeah? He didn't care for Dane like that. Well, fuck, maybe he did. Tommy loved to hump, and he didn't seem too picky regarding with whom. What's he messing with you for? He's not messing with either of us. I was checking your credulity. You got me, Tex. I'm a credulous motherfucker these days. Our boys are goddamned credulous, too, if you could get them to cop to it. You're a devious one. Funny, you and Glenn getting together. He's such a rube. I chuckled. Yeah, Glenn is as pure as the driven snow. Plus, unlike us, his family was damned progressive. A well-adjusted man's one of my turn-ons. That's the attraction? He reads. He can be a devil. I like that a whole lot. He's hot and makes a heap of money. Goodness, Vicky, you're a real bitch when you want. I didn't mean anything by that, however. His bluntness was sweet in its own way. The fire burned low. Victor stood and stretched. I was raised Pentecostal. Got any idea what that's like? I saw a few things you wouldn't believe. My daddy was a snake-handling, babbling in tongues, psycho son of a bitch, let me tell you what. I've no problem with the plausibility of the fundamentally implausible after witnessing my daddy and two uncles cast demons from my cousin one sultry Blackwoods night. I can't say I'm religious, but I surely do believe we aren't alone on this mortal coil. There are frightful things lurking in the shadows. I remembered the woman's voice whispering in the dark. There are frightful things. I got goosebumps. He said, something else I didn't mention when I told you about the dreams I had of Tommy. I think I pushed it down into my subconscious. Whenever I first see him, for a split second, he's somebody else. He covers his face with his hands as if he's rubbing his eyes or sobbing, and when he looks up, it's him, smiling this evil little smile. Once in a while, he ducks his head and pantomimes pulling on a ski mask. Same thing. It's him again. The act bothers the fuck out of me. Anyway, good night. Shadows from the dying fire capered against the trunks of the trees and the boulders nearby. The goosebumps returned, and I recognized the nauseated thrill in my stomach as a reaction to being watched. This sense of being observed was powerful, and I became conscious again of our frailty, the dim sliver of firelight, the flimsy shelter of the tent, our insignificance. I massaged my aching forearm. Farther out, branches crashed and grew still. A few minutes passed as I listened to the night. Weariness overcame my nerves. I decided to make for the tent, and as I rose, a large, dark shape emerged from the brush and moved onto the road about 70 feet away. There was sufficient starlight to discern its bulky outline, a patch of thicker blackness against the blurry backdrop, but not enough to identify individual features. It had to be a bear, and so I'm sure my brain gave it a bear-like shape. Bears didn't particularly frighten me. I'd gone hunting on occasion as a teen and hiked plenty since. Bears, cougars, moose, critters could be reliably expected to live and let live. This encounter, however, alarmed me. Had the cooking smells drawn it in? Glenn's gun lay snug in my pocket since the brawl, but that didn't comfort me. It was a .25 automatic with no stopping power, more likely to infuriate a bear than kill it. The animal stood in the center of the road, and there was no mistaking. It was staring at me. Then another shape appeared near the first, and that caused my balls to tighten. The second animal rose directly from the road, as if the shadows had coalesced into a solid form, and as it materialized, I noted that even obscured by darkness, it didn't resemble any bear I'd ever seen. The beast was too lean, too angular. The neck and forelegs were abnormally long, and its skull lopsided and cumbersome. I pulled the automatic and chambered around. I considered calling to my companions, but hesitated because of the impression this entire situation was balanced on the edge of some terrible consequence, and any precipitous action on my part would initiate the chain reaction. There are terrible things. A cloud rolled across the stars, and as the darkness thickened, the animals moved in an unnatural sideways fashion, an undulation at odds with their bulk, and vanished. Symbols of warning conjured from night mist and shadows, ill omens dispensed, they drained back into the earth. I half-crouched, gun in my fist, until my legs cramped. A scream echoed far off from one of the hidden gulches, and I almost blew a hole in my foot. It took me a long while to convince myself it had been the cry of a bear or a wildcat. and not a human. By then, it was dawn.
There are two things I really want to unpack about this installment. The first is something I'm acutely familiar with. The second is something I've had the tiniest of brushes with. Let's do that one first. I was 6'2" by the time I was about 15. I was the kid who was always stood by the teacher in the school photo, and I did not need to be standing on a bench. I have varied between 200 and 300 pounds throughout my life, and odds are always will. I am softly spoken. I wear glasses. I read a lot. I'm articulate. And I grew up in a community that either fished, farmed, or later merchant banked. So of course, some people assumed I was gay, and acted accordingly, which meant they made my life hell in short bursts. Never physically, they were unfortunately too clever for that, but my secondary school career was defined by systemic psychological bullying on 3 or 4 different theatres at once, when it wasn't defined by grief, which, written down, sounds like a My Chemical Romance lyric, but trust me, there were some good days too. But there was also being called a puff, and a friend of mine refusing to talk to me for months because he assumed I had a crush on him, and a dozen little incidents that, hitting at a time when I had no idea what my sexuality was, registered more than they maybe should have done. And this is the tiniest, thinnest end of the wedge when it comes to discrimination. I'm a mostly middle-class white guy. Like the man says, the world is locked on its lowest difficulty setting for me, but still, I got these incidents, and still, 3 decades later, I remember them, and I can only imagine what I would remember if they had been constant, or if their assumptions had been accurate. I mention them here because of the extended, untidy, brutal fight that defines the middle of this story, and appropriately the middle of nowhere where this story takes place. Small towns are tide pools of bigotry and assumption, and our lead characters encounter that firsthand this week. It would have been so easy for Laird to set this fight up as a means of escalating the stakes and doing the heroes, if heroes they indeed are, down. Of the town closing ranks, the harbinger delivering his warning. Instead, though, it comes across as something more mundane, and as a result, infinitely more horrifying. People. Blank-faced, bigoted people who have no problem beating problems they see into submission, even when those problems are people too. Especially when those problems are people too. Monsters in the hills, and the towns, and the cities, and our leads here may be ready for them, but that doesn't mean they aren't still staggered by seeing humanity's ugliest face, even as they break its teeth. And that brings us to the other element, the one I am intimately familiar with. The creeping sensation of something's gravity beginning to act upon the leads, embodied both in the book and the quiet way no one talks about it, even as they talk about it. This is one of our most insidious, dangerous survival techniques, accepting the impossible as long as it pays its rent on time, not looking the horrific in the eye as long as the check clears, wonder and horror on nodding acquaintance in the street, because if we talk to them we'd have to admit we know nothing. That's what small towns do. That's what really small, rural towns do, and that's where I grew up, and it makes no sense, but it's true. They accept the impossible. As long as it's their impossible, they become relaxed around danger, and after a while, even protective of the most broken, horrifying, terrible things that people have done to one another within those towns' limits. It's slow burn, generational Stockholm syndrome, and something the leads absolutely don't see coming. And the fact we do makes the horror even more acute. PseudoPod relies on you for basically everything, but the two things which you can really help out with are either spreading the word or paying the bills. Let's do spreading the word first, because I always get to that one last. If you can't afford to donate to keep us going, that's absolutely fine. There is something you can donate which doesn't cost you money, just costs you time. If you liked an episode, talk about it, tweet about it, blog about it. People still blog. I checked. I'm one of them. If you have a podcast yourself and you'd like us to appear on it as guests, get in touch. We love doing that kind of stuff. Most of all, Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, all these places. For the first two, leave a review. It's kind of like Amazon. Once you get above a certain level, the recommendation algorithms all kick in. With Spotify, we'd love to be on Spotify. For podcasts, Spotify is invitation only, and they invite people who people say they want on Spotify. So, with apologies to the English language for the length of this sentence, if you want us on Spotify, ask Spotify to invite us, because we'd love to be there. Now, let's talk money. There are two ways that you can support us financially. The first is by donating, either through pseudopod.org and clicking on Feed the Pod. There you'll see two options: donate, any amount you want, or subscribe, which starts at around $5 a month. Both help immensely. You would be amazed how much the subscription helps long term. The other option is Patreon, and again, you can choose what level you pledge at. The one thing I will say is everyone who pledges at $5 or up gets access to our premium content folder, into which new material is added basically monthly, and there is a massive backlog of stuff in there already. And as I'm recording this, I can tell you that the next thing to go in there will be this month's Patreon exclusive audio, which is Karen Bovenmire and myself talking about The Secret History of Wonder Woman by Jill Lepore, and the excellent Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman movie, both of which covers the same ground. So, Patreon, or PayPal, or I can't think of a word that begins with P, which involves raising our profile on social media. So let's just go Patreon, PayPal, or raising our profile. How about that? If you can do any of those things, we would be incredibly grateful. We will be back next week with the conclusion of Mysterium Tremendum, which will again be written by Laird Barron and read by the fantastic John Padgett. Then, as now, we will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. And PseudoPod would like to leave you with this quote from no other source than Twin Peaks. Because that's what you do in a town where a yellow light still means slow down, not go faster. See you next week, folks.